The US Food and Drug Administration has said on Thursday that the drug maker Endo Pharmaceuticals must remove a powerful opioid painkiller called Opana ER from the market. And the agency is saying that this is the first time they are calling for an opioid to be taken off the market due to, quote, the public health consequences of abuse. So a little bit more of what the FDA is saying. We are facing an opioid epidemic, a public health crisis, and we must take all necessary steps to reduce the scope of opioid misuse and abuse. We will continue to take regulatory steps when we see situations where an opioid product's risks outweigh its benefits, not only for its intended patient population, but also in regard to its potential for misuse and abuse. So just to give you some background on Opana, this drug is about twice as powerful as Oxycontin and other often abused opioids. The FDA approved it in 2006, and they have tried to make measures so that it's more difficult to abuse. They made a hard outer coating so it's more difficult to crush. However, when the drug maker changed the formula in 2012, some addicts began injecting it instead. In the Indiana case, the shared needles helped spread the HIV infection to over 142 people. The United States, as you guys may know, is in the midst of an opioid overdose epidemic. According to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, opioid overdose killed more than 33,000 people in 2015, more than any year on record. Nearly half of all overdose deaths involve some sort of prescription drug. And we're gonna get into that in the second half of the story with a new study coming out by the New York Times. But just to get your reaction on this half of the story, to their end, Endo Pharmaceuticals has released a statement in part saying, despite the FDA's request to withdraw Opana ER from the market, this request does not indicate uncertainty with the product's safety or efficacy when taken as prescribed. Endo remains confident in the body of evidence established through clinical research demonstrating that Opana ER has a favorable risk-benefit profile when used as intended in appropriate patients. So the larger question here before we get into more details on the opioid epidemic in America is Endo to blame here? Are they doing enough? It's so difficult for doctors to make sure that patients are not abusing these prescriptions. What do you think about this coming out about this particular drug?
Well, I mean, no company is necessarily responsible for what people do when they don't use a product as intended. Theoretically, but some products are easier to use in unintended ways, and some products that are designed to be as strong as possible. It's not that's the problem. It's when you then combine that with lobbyists for these gigantic pharma companies that are pushing it to be prescribed to as many people as possible. You naturally increase the odds that some people are going to overdose on it or use it in inappropriate ways.
Yes, I was thinking, I was trying to cite this beforehand, but there was this study about most patients not being aware that their doctors were in some way incentivized to prescribe the things that they prescribed. And when you look at the pharmaceutical lobbies and the lack of transparency in that case I just mentioned, it's sort of insane when you compare this against the scope of the war on drugs and how harshly penalized people have been for things like marijuana, which I would say are not responsible for
33,000 deaths a year.
33,000 addiction-related deaths.
Yeah, it's probably lower.
It's interesting to just kind of follow where the money goes.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that sort of the default in the majority of states is on prescription pain medication rather than investing in maybe, because I'm a marijuana user for my own like medical reasons as well. And it's interesting to see that I live in a state where I can go to a doctor and have medical marijuana prescribed, whereas in another state for my medical issues I might be prescribed, and in the past I have been prescribed, I was prescribed Oxycontin and Oxycodone at one point in time. That's insane,
that's too high.
And it did not help me. It was horrible, it was a bad time. So it's just really, it's strange to see that there is obviously a correlation between people abusing these drugs and people who are being prescribed these drugs, and it's hard to find exactly what level of accountability we need to have, and yet there still aren't really any major proposed solutions aside from, well, just pull this one off the market. But a lot of people in this, and we're getting our information from CNN, we're saying, more needs to be done. It's great that Opana is now being taken off the market, but this is just one of many. I mean, fentanyl is another one that's being abused. It goes on, and I think that will sort of segue segue us over into an article from Vox.com, and they are taking their information from a new report from the New York Times. And basically, the tagline on this story and why it's making a lot of headlines is, in 1 year, drug overdoses killed more Americans than the entire Vietnam War did. So they are sort of breaking this down and also providing a little bit of an explanation that I want to dive into with you guys as well. The Times contacted local and state agencies across the US to come up with a rough estimate of people who have died from drug overdoses, and it calculated that 59,000 to 65,000 people died of overdoses last year, and that is more than the 58,000 US soldiers who died in the Vietnam War. So a little bit more on the background and the opioid epidemic explained. Back in the 1990s, doctors were persuaded to treat pain as a serious medical issue. There's a good reason for that. About 100 million US adults suffer from chronic pain, according to a 2011 report from the Institute of Medicine. Pharmaceutical companies took advantage of this concern through a big marketing campaign. They got doctors to prescribe products like Oxycontin and Percocet in droves, even though the evidence for opioids treating long-term chronic pain is very weak, despite their effectiveness in short-term acute pain, while the evidence that opioids cause harm in the long term is very strong. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, we're seeing it.
Right, so that really speaks exactly to what you were saying, Kim, and I think it's something that we don't talk about enough, and I think that most people are just unaware of, that there is an incentive oftentimes for people to be prescribed the pain medication that they're being prescribed, and I think there should be more transparency. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would like to know if my doctor was compensated to prescribe me a specific prescription drug.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird if, like, theoretically, if you're on Instagram and you've gotten $1,000 for sunglasses or fit tea, that you have to be transparent about that.
That makes you poop.
Exactly. And yeah, like, so we talk about the relative culpability of these different groups and stuff, and it's easy to say, is a drug being misused or used in an irresponsible way? But that doesn't just mean one thing. It doesn't just mean that a person's crushing it and injecting it. A person can misuse it, but a doctor can misuse it, a company can misuse it. And when you look at this chart and you see, I don't know if you can see it here, you see the deaths shooting up.
No.
Starting in '99, what, did people not have pain back in 1999? No, I think we had roughly the same amount of pain, we just didn't have the same number of deaths because we treated pain differently, which means that something like 40,000 deaths last year alone could have been avoided. And when you look at the size under that graph, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths that did not need to happen. In 1 year, you're looking at almost twice as many people as die in car accidents. And think about it, everybody basically drives, and we drive a lot every day. Far fewer people do drugs, prescription or otherwise. I mean, that is a crazy increased risk there, and an unnecessary one, as is clear from the 1999 example.
Right. Yeah, and from my own personal experience, I remember when I was being prescribed, it was like maybe Percocet too. So a whole bunch of that. Well, it was following a knee surgery, but what ended up happening was that I was given a huge prescription that, because of other factors in my life, I would all say that I was addicted at all, but I definitely had a sort of dependency that messed with my brain a lot. And I understand that I was given this amount of Percocet that I didn't need. I had knee surgery, I needed it for about a week to get over it, and I had enough pills for a much longer time than that, that's the sort of accountability and transparency that I think we need from doctors to be like, okay, this is what she's going through. Pain medication is okay in doses, but it just seems like there wasn't any oversight. Whereas like, oh, she's having knee surgery, I trust her, she'll be fine, she's an athlete, she'll be okay. And you can't put that on a patient because you have no idea what they might be predisposed for. So a little bit more on what we can do as far as a solution. Well, Vox is saying the likely solution is to get opioid users into treatment. According to a 2016 report by the Surgeon General, just 10% of Americans with a drug use disorder obtain specialty treatment. The report found that the low rate was largely explained by a shortage of treatment options. Does that jive with what you guys know about drug addiction? Do you feel like there's a shortage of treatment options?
Well, I think that it certainly seems like the money is in getting people to buy more drugs than they actually need.
Well, then why isn't the money in the treatment? That, to me, that could be a very lucrative business. I've seen intervention. Those places are decked out.
That seems like that's true for people who can afford really fancy. I think that the government needs to get more involved in terms of funding that. There was actually quite a bit of discussion on both the Republican and Democratic side from some politicians before the election about how to deal with this. And people like, not just the Democratic candidates, but John Kasich, for instance, made a big deal out of this issue. But then Donald Trump got elected and he doesn't seem to care at all about it. Certainly doesn't talk about it much. And so the impetus to actually fix it at the federal level seems to have largely gone away.
And that blows my mind, how we're not looking to fix this at a federal level.
Yeah, especially when you have to imagine that a lot of the people that make up those 59,000 deaths are not hippie libs from the coasts.
No.
It's Republicans. It's Republicans who live in Tennessee and Kentucky and everywhere across the country. It affects all classes of people. It affects all races of people and all partisan identifications. It should be the problem that's easiest to solve for the US, but it seems to be one that we're willing to keep kicking the can down the road and letting tens of thousands of people unnecessarily die every year.
Yeah, and to that exact point, my dad is a chaplain on the Ohio River region, and I was talking to him just yesterday, and he's been talking to me about the two reasons why he does funerals or why he's really called to serve are because of officers committing suicide or people who have served committing suicide. That's not something you talk about. And the second is drug overdoses because of the time that they're on these ships, we're serving in the Coast Guard or on the towboats, and that's just something that it's not treated. And he was saying literally just yesterday, before I knew we were covering the story, he's like, you look around at the funeral at this family for someone who's died for a drug that they were prescribed.
Yeah,
it's insane.
Young Turks now has over 6 billion lifetime views. You know who did that? You did that. We're now larger than CNN, ABC, you name a news network online, we're larger than them. And you built all that as everyone scoffed and didn't believe. And here we are, guys, thanks to you. Build independent media together with us at tytnetwork.com/join.